The screaming stopped 3 days ago. That's what the guard said when he brought bread and water to the new prisoners in the Tower of London, autumn of 1584. He said it matter-of-factly, the way a man might comment on the weather. The screaming from the cell below, the one they called the Little Ease, had finally stopped. Not because the prisoner had been released, not because mercy had been shown, but because the human voice, like the human body, has limits. And the men who designed these chambers knew exactly where those limits were. The guard's boots echoed against stone as he walked away, and in that echo, you could hear the weight of centuries. Because what we're about to explore isn't just a catalog of cruelty. It's a window into the darkest capabilities of human imagination, the terrible ingenuity we possess when we decide another human being deserves to suffer. These weren't accidents. They weren't spontaneous acts of rage. They were carefully designed, meticulously crafted instruments and methods, born from minds that had considered every angle, every nerve ending, every breaking point. Welcome to a journey through the medieval world's most sadistic innovation. What you're about to hear will challenge your understanding of what humans are capable of doing to one another. And I promise you, by the end, you'll understand why the screaming always stops eventually. But before we descend into these depths together, if you're drawn to the darkest corners of history, the stories that textbooks won't tell you, hit that follow button. Because every week, we illuminate the shadows where truth is stranger and more terrifying than any fiction. The architecture of agony. The year is 1215, and in the basement of Carcassonne Castle in southern France, a master craftsman named Guillaume is putting the finishing touches on his latest commission. He's not building a chair, exactly, though it has that shape. He's building what will come to be known as the Judas cradle, and he's testing the point with his thumb, checking its angle against the drawings provided by the bishop's inquisitor. The point must be sharp enough to cause excruciating pain, but not so sharp that it pierces vital organs too quickly. Death is easy. Suffering is an art form. Guillaume doesn't think of himself as a monster. He has a wife, 3 children, and he attends Mass every Sunday. In his mind, he's simply a craftsman fulfilling a contract, no different than a blacksmith forging plowshares or a carpenter building pews. This is what we must understand about medieval torture. It wasn't performed by cackling villains in dark robes. It was bureaucratic, methodical, sometimes even holy. The Judas cradle itself was deceptively simple, a pyramid-shaped seat with a sharp point at its apex. The victim would be suspended by ropes above it, then slowly lowered onto the point, which would enter the anus, vagina, or perineum. But here's where the terrible ingenuity emerged. The torturer controlled everything: the speed of descent, the angle of penetration, the duration of suspension. A skilled practitioner could keep a person alive and conscious on the cradle for days, adding weights to their legs, rotating them, lifting and lowering them in rhythms designed to prevent the mercy of unconsciousness. In the records of the Languedoc Inquisition, there's a notation from 1232 about a woman named Esclarmonde. She was accused of Cathar heresy. The scribe recorded that she lasted 4 days on the cradle before she confessed to consorting with demons. Demons she'd never met, acts she'd never committed. But by then, infection had already set in. She died 6 days later in her cell, and her confession was used to condemn 17 other people to the flames. This is the first lesson of medieval torture. It was never really about truth. It was about power, control, and the breaking of human will. The confession was inevitable. The torture was the point. Stand in the museum at Rothenburg ob der Tauber today, and you can see her, the Iron Maiden, standing 7 feet tall, her exterior decorated with the serene face of the Virgin Mary. Tourists take photographs. Children peer through the gaps. But very few understand what they're really looking at. Open the front panel, and you see the interior lined with spikes, carefully positioned so that when the device closed around a human body, none of the spikes would immediately kill. The ones near the eyes would blind. The ones at the chest would puncture lungs, but miss the heart. The ones near the abdomen would perforate organs slowly, ensuring death by infection and internal bleeding over days, not minutes. But here's what's even more disturbing. The Iron Maiden, as iconic as it's become, might be the most honest of all medieval tortures because it looks exactly like what it is. Unlike the rack or the wheel, there's no disguising its purpose. And yet, according to the municipal records of Nuremberg in 1515, the city's Iron Maiden was placed in the town square during market days. Not hidden in a dungeon, but displayed publicly, its doors opened periodically to show the remains of those inside as a warning to others. The psychology was deliberate. Johann Philipp Siebenkees, the 18th-century German philosopher, wrote about witnessing the aftermath of an Iron Maiden execution as a young man. He described the smell, copper, and decay that hung in the square for days afterward. He described how vendors continued selling bread and cheese within sight of it, how children played, how life went on around this monument to suffering as if it were merely part of the landscape. This normalization of cruelty is perhaps more disturbing than the devices themselves, because it reveals something uncomfortable. Given the right circumstances, the right justifications, humans can adapt to almost anything, can accept almost anything, can even celebrate it. Devices of gradual disintegration. The rack stands in a category of its own, not for its complexity, but for its patience. Picture the scene. The Tower of London, 1605, and Guy Fawkes is being strapped down. His wrists and ankles are tied to wooden rollers at opposite ends of an oak table. The lieutenant of the tower, a man named Sir William Wadd, doesn't rush. He explains what's about to happen with the courtesy of a doctor describing a medical procedure. The mechanism is simple. Turn the handles, and the rollers rotate, pulling the limbs in opposite directions. But simplicity conceals sophistication. A skilled torturer. And yes, they considered it a skill, something that required training and expertise, would turn the handles slowly. A quarter turn. Wait. Let the body adjust to its new configuration. Let the panic build. Let the victim understand that this could stop at any moment, that mercy was possible, that confession could end it. But what happens to the human body under such tension is where the true horror lies. First, the joints begin to separate. Shoulders and hips dislocating with sounds witnesses described as similar to green wood cracking. Then the ligaments stretch and tear. The spine elongates, compressing discs and trapping nerves. Victims could grow inches during a racking session, a grotesque parody of growth that was, of course, permanent damage. Guy Fawkes, according to the Tower records, lasted through 3 sessions on the rack. His signature on his confession, still preserved in the National Archives, is barely legible. A shaking scrawl from a man whose arms had been partially torn from their sockets. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But when he stood on the scaffold, he threw himself off, breaking his neck to avoid the worse fate that awaited. Even after the rack, he had enough presence of mind to choose the manner of his death. That should tell you something about how bad the alternative was. The Judas Cradle's companion. The pear of anguish. Some torture devices were designed for internal application, and none more insidious than the pear of anguish. Imagine a metal bulb, shaped like a pear, divided into segments. It looks almost decorative, something that might sit on a noble's desk as a curiosity. But insert it into a bodily orifice, mouth, anus, or vagina, and turn the screw at its end, and those segments slowly expand, opening like a terrible flower. The Spanish Inquisition had 3 sizes. The oral pear for liars and blasphemers, the vaginal pear for women accused of adultery or sexual congress with Satan, the rectal pear for homosexual men and passive sodomites. The differentiation itself is telling. The torture was tailored to the supposed sin, as if the punishment must mirror the transgression in some cosmic balancing of scales. In the Inquisition records from Toledo, dated 1491, there's a detailed account of a woman named Maria. She was accused of denying the divinity of Christ. The inquisitor's notes are clinical, almost boring in their precision. Applied the pear at the hour of vespers, 2 turns of the screw, Subject showed signs of distress. After evening prayers, 3 additional turns, subject recanted statement, maintained confession through the night. What the records don't mention, what they never mention, is what Maria's life looked like afterward. The pair didn't just cause immediate pain, it caused permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, incontinence, and infection. If Maria survived, and many didn't, she would have carried the physical evidence of her correction for the rest of her life. And that, too, was intentional. The torture marked you, changed you, made you a living testimony to the cost of defiance. Breaking wheels and brazen bulls. The breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel, represents torture as public spectacle. Erected in town squares across medieval Europe, it was both execution device and entertainment. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would use an iron hammer to methodically break every major bone in their body, working from the extremities toward the core, from the fingers and toes up to the shoulders and hips. But here's the refinement that separates this from mere brutality. The wheel would then be hoisted onto a tall pole, displaying the broken body to the crowd. Death wasn't immediate. With bones shattered but organs intact, victims could survive for days, exposed to the elements, conscious and in agony, while townspeople went about their daily business below. In Nuremberg, 1589, a criminal named Hans Schmidt was broken on the wheel for murder. The execution took place on a Friday morning, and according to the town chronicler, Schmidt remained conscious and speaking until Sunday afternoon. Witnesses reported that he spent his final hours praying loudly, his voice carrying across the square, interrupted by screams when birds landed on his body and pecked at his wounds. No one drove the birds away. That was considered part of the punishment, to be denied even the dignity of dying unmolested. The brazen bull, meanwhile, was torture as aristocratic innovation. According to legend, it was designed in ancient Greece, but medieval rulers refined and revived it with enthusiasm. The device was a hollow bronze statue of a bull with a door in its side. The victim would be locked inside and a fire lit beneath it. As the metal heated, the person inside would be slowly roasted alive. But here's the signature sadistic detail. The bull's head was designed with a series of tubes and chambers that would convert the victim's screams into sounds resembling a bull's bellowing. This acoustic engineering served 2 purposes. First, it made the execution more entertaining for observers, transforming human agony into animal sounds. Second, and more insidiously, it dehumanized the victim even as they died. You weren't listening to a person suffering. You were listening to a bull. It was easier that way. Perillos of Athens, the bull's alleged inventor, supposedly became its first victim, the creator consumed by his own creation. Whether that story is true or apocryphal, it contains a certain poetic justice that medieval audiences would have appreciated. They understood irony. They understood symbolism. They just didn't understand mercy. The subtler sadism. Positional tortures. Not all medieval torture required elaborate devices or dramatic spectacle. Some of the most effective tortures were invisible to casual observers. They simply required forcing the human body into positions it wasn't designed to maintain. The little E's, that cell in the Tower of London mentioned at the beginning of this story, was a cube measuring approximately 4 feet on each side. Too small to stand, too small to lie down flat. Prisoners kept there were forced into a perpetual crouch or fetal position. Days in the little E's produced severe muscle cramps and spasms. Weeks produced permanent damage to joints and spine. Months produced madness. The records mention one prisoner, Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest who spent 4 months in the Little E's before his execution in 1581. When he was finally removed to stand trial, he couldn't stand unassisted. His body had forgotten how. Guards had to carry him to the courtroom, where he was condemned to death for treason. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, probably a mercy after what he'd already endured. Then there was the strapado, deceptively simple in its mechanics. The victims' hands would be tied behind their back, and they'd be hoisted into the air by those bound wrists. The entire body weight hanging from arms wrenched backward, shoulders dislocating almost immediately. But skilled torturers would then drop the victim suddenly before jerking them to a stop, a technique that could tear muscles and ligaments throughout the body. In the Venetian prison system of the 15th century, the strappado was used with mechanical precision. The Doge's interrogation protocols specified exactly how many drops and jerks should be administered based on the severity of the suspected crime. 3 drops for minor offenses, 5 for serious crimes, 7 for capital charges. It was bureaucratized suffering, torture by checklist, human pain reduced to procedure. The scavenger's daughter, compression as art form. If the rack pulled the body apart, the scavenger's daughter crushed it together. Invented in the reign of King Henry VIII by the Tower of London's Lieutenant Leonard Skeffington, this device forced the human body into a tightly compressed position, head to knees, arms trapped at sides. The physics are straightforward and devastating. As the metal restraints tightened, blood flow became restricted. Breathing became labored. The spine compressed, but the real damage was internal. Ribs cracked inward. Pressure built in the skull. Blood vessels burst, causing hemorrhaging from nose, ears, and eyes. After only an hour, victims' faces would be unrecognizable, swollen and purple with trapped blood. What made the scavenger's daughter particularly insidious was that it left relatively few external marks. A person could be tortured to the edge of death, released, and appear mostly intact, though internally the damage was catastrophic. This made it a favorite for interrogations where confessions were needed, but the accused might need to appear in court or public afterward. Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer, was subjected to the scavenger's daughter and later the rack in 1546. The records of her interrogation note that she was tortured with great severity, but never confessed to the heresies she was accused of. She was eventually burned at stake, but had to be carried to the execution in a chair because her body could no longer support her weight. Witnesses said she remained conscious and praying until the smoke overcame her. The human capacity for endurance, it turns out, can exceed even the torturer's capacity for cruelty. Immersion and inversion. Water and suspension. The human relationship with water made it a natural tool for torture. Waterboarding wasn't invented in the 21st century. Medieval interrogators understood its effectiveness perfectly. The technique they called the water cure involved forcing the victim to ingest massive quantities of water, distending the stomach and bladder until organs began to fail. Sometimes they'd lay the person on a slanted board, head lower than feet, and pour water over a cloth covering the face, nearly identical to modern waterboarding. But medieval torturers added their own refinements. In some regions, after forcing the victim to consume water until their abdomen was grotesquely swollen, they'd place a plank across the stomach and stand on it, crushing internal organs and forcing water back up through the esophagus and nose. The sensation of drowning combined with internal crushing created a synergy of suffering. Then there was the practice of immersion in filth. The German cities maintained special pits, filled with human waste, offal, and rotting animal carcasses. Criminals or accused heretics would be lowered into these pits up to their necks and left for days. The toxins would enter through any small cuts or abrasions. Infections were guaranteed. Survival was rare. And if you did survive, the psychological trauma of having been submerged in human waste was its own punishment, a defilement that went beyond the physical. Meanwhile, suspension tortures explored the opposite approach, removing the body from contact with solid ground. Being hung by the wrists or ankles for extended periods caused its own cascade of medical horrors, blood pooling in extremities, nerve death, hallucinations from sensory deprivation. The judging committees of the Inquisition had detailed schedules for how long someone could be suspended before permanent damage occurred, not because they wanted to prevent that damage, but because they wanted to calibrate it. The saw. Inversion of the sacred. Perhaps no torture device is more straightforward than the saw, and few are more psychologically devastating. The victim would be hung upside down, legs spread, and a two-man saw would be used to bisect them lengthwise, starting at the groin. The inversion was crucial. Hanging upside down kept blood flowing to the brain, maintaining consciousness. It also meant the saw could cut through the genitals, pelvis, and deep into the torso before hitting any vital organs. Some accounts claim victims remained conscious until the saw reached the navel or even the chest. This torture was reserved for specific crimes, typically those considered sexually transgressive. In the Holy Roman Empire, it was used for adultery and homosexuality. The symbolism was explicit. You've misused these parts of your body, so we'll destroy them first, and we'll make sure you're aware of every moment. What's particularly chilling is how the saw represents an inversion of craftsmanship. The same tool that built cathedrals and carved holy icons was turned on human flesh. The same cooperative labor that created beauty, two men working together with a saw, was perverted into shared butchery. The medieval world understood symbolism, understood the power of inverting the sacred, turning tools of creation into instruments of destruction. Rats, fire, and fear. Psychological warfare. Some tortures required no metal devices at all, just an understanding of human psychology and animal behavior. The rat torture was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. A cage or pot containing rats would be placed against the victim's stomach or chest and then heated. The rats, desperate to escape the heat, would claw and chew through the only soft material available, human flesh. The beauty of this torture, from the torturer's perspective, was that the victim could see and hear everything, could watch the container being placed, could hear the rats scrabbling, could feel the heat increasing, could anticipate what was about to happen. The psychological torture began long before the physical, and that anticipation magnified the horror. Fire tortures exploited similar principles. Feet held to flames not long enough to char, but long enough to blister and cook slowly. Brands applied to various body parts in a deliberate progression. The torturer controlled not just the pain, but the duration, the pattern, the narrative of suffering. And victims, knowing fire was involved, often broke during the preparation, before the flames even touched skin. That's when you know a torture is truly effective, when the threat of it is sufficient. The Spanish Inquisition's manual for interrogation, the Directorium Inquisitorum, actually discussed this explicitly. It noted that sometimes the most effective torture was simply showing the instruments to the accused, explaining in detail what each one would do, how it would feel, how long it would last. Many confessions were obtained without ever applying the devices. The imagination, properly directed, could be its own torture chamber. The heretic's fork and the breast ripper. Some devices were designed specifically for symbolic punishment, torture that made a statement about the crime. The heretic's fork was a metal device with spikes at both ends, placed beneath the chin and breastbone, forcing the head into an upright position. The victim couldn't move, couldn't speak clearly, couldn't sleep. The words, "Abjuro," I recant, were often engraved on the device, a constant reminder of what was required. Accused heretics would wear this device for days during their trials, unable to lower their heads, unable to communicate clearly, slowly exhausted by the impossibility of rest. By the time they reached verdict, they were already broken. The torture wasn't to extract confession. It was to ensure that the confession, once given, would never be recanted. The breast ripper, meanwhile, was used specifically on women accused of adultery, miscarriage, or heresy. 4 metal claws, heated red-hot, would be used to tear the breasts from the body, sometimes while the woman was still alive, sometimes as part of execution, always publicly, always with maximum humiliation. The gendering of this torture is significant. Male and female bodies were tortured differently, and those differences reflected medieval anxieties about gender and sexuality. Women's breasts were both sacred, as in representations of the nursing Madonna, and profane, as objects of sexual desire. To destroy them was to destroy both the woman's femininity and her humanity in one act. The torture said, "You have violated your role as woman, so we remove the markers of womanhood." Crushing. Peine forte et dure. In England, there was a torture that was technically not torture at all. It was enhanced interrogation before we had that phrase. Peine forte et dure, or hard and forceful punishment, was used on accused criminals who refused to enter a plea. Without a plea, there could be no trial. Without a trial, the accused's property couldn't be seized. It would pass to their heirs instead. So the solution was simple. Place the accused on their back, place a board across their chest, and pile stones on the board until they either entered a plea or died. The law said this wasn't torture because it wasn't being done to extract confession. It was simply pressing until the person cooperated with the legal system. The most famous case was Giles Corey in Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. Over the course of 2 days, more and more stones were added to his chest. Witnesses reported that his tongue was pressed out of his mouth, his eyes bulged, his bones began to crack. Each time they asked for his plea, he replied only, "More weight." He died after 2 days, protecting his property for his family, never entering a plea, never giving the court jurisdiction over his estate. The legal fiction that this wasn't torture is almost more disturbing than the practice itself. It reveals how societies create elaborate justifications for cruelty, how we build systems that allow us to cause suffering while maintaining the fiction that we're simply following procedure, simply doing what the law requires. The conclusion: the screaming always stops. We've journeyed through 20 examples of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty, but we've barely scratched the surface. There were hundreds of other devices and methods: the wheel, the breaking box, the Spanish spider, the tongue tearer, the crocodile shears. Each region had its specialties. Each era had its innovations. The creativity humans brought to the project of causing suffering is genuinely staggering. But here's what we need to understand. These weren't the products of dark ages or primitive minds. Many of these tortures were designed and implemented during the Renaissance, the age of Leonardo and Michelangelo, during the Reformation, the age of printing presses and expanding literacy. These devices coexisted with sublime art, beautiful music, and complex philosophy. Culture and cruelty aren't opposites, they're twins. And perhaps most disturbingly, these tortures were often legal, sanctioned, documented in official records with bureaucratic precision. When Anne Askew was tortured, high-ranking officials turned the wheel themselves. When Galileo faced the Inquisition, the threat of torture came from men who were scholars and intellectuals. The veneer of civilization is thinner than we like to believe. The guard was right. The screaming always stops eventually. The human voice gives out. The mind retreats. The body breaks. But the capacity to inflict such suffering never goes away. It just finds new forms, new justifications, new technologies. The devices may change, but the impulse remains. So when you visit those museums and see these implements behind glass, clean and still, remember, each one of these devices was used on real people who had names, families, hopes, who woke up one morning never imagining they'd end their day strapped to a wheel or locked in an iron box, who believed, until the very end, that surely mercy would come. Surely someone would stop this madness. But the screaming always stops eventually, and the world keeps turning. What we've explored today represents the darkest capabilities of human imagination when directed toward suffering. These weren't aberrations. They were systems. If these stories have disturbed you, unsettled you, made you question what humans are capable of, then you understand why this history matters. Subscribe to witness more of the Shadows history casts, because those who forget the darkness are doomed to repeat it. Till next time, remember, the past isn't past. It's just waiting.